With the existence of vampires, there's gotta be an occupation to stop them. I mean, we can't just let them feed on humans. Somebody's gotta do something. Vampires have existed for a really long time. Like a long-ass time. Vampiric entities are recorded across the world, and vampires, as we know them today, are largely inspired by Dracula in a sense. But there is one character from Bram Stoker's Dracula that we must also cover besides Dracula. One whose name is synonymous with Dracula himself, and one whose occupation spans supernatural films and series, and essentially anything to do with that. And that is Van Helsing. Abraham Van Helsing, a professor, doctor, lawyer, philosopher, scientist, vampire hunter, metaphysician. Wait, what was that previous one? Van Helsing is a normal human who goes after the Count when he is called by a former student, John Seward, to assist with a mysterious illness. Van Helsing's occupation as a vampire hunter is considered the archetype for our modern monster hunter characters.
My vote is to save as many lives as possible.
I had no idea just how big the world is.
Hunter, what even is that thing? It's not like any Rathalos I've ever seen.
Not those, these. Buffy, Blade, Geralt of Rivia, Sam and Dean Winchester all share the same fundamental building blocks established by Abraham Van Helsing. Abraham Van Helsing was first portrayed by Edward von Sloan in the 1931 film Dracula. Peter Cushing portrayed a much younger version of Abraham, and a noticeably departure of the original character. See, it was the other characters who would get physical with Dracula till the Hammer film, The Horrors of Dracula, came out in 1958, where now Abraham Van Helsing actually went toe-to-toe with the bloodsucker himself. Other actors include Herbert Loom in the 1970 film Count Dracula as Professor Van Helsing, Walter Legast in the 1979 remake of Nosferatu as Van Helsing, and should be mentioned that the original 1922 film had a loose adaptation of him as the character Professor Bulwer. Lawrence Oliver in Dracula from 1979 as Van Helsing. I'm starting to notice that we just dropped the first name. We had the talented Anthony Hopkins as a more erratic, unpredictable Van Helsing, who was a bit more sociopathic in the 1992 adaptation Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Mel Brooks as a more comedic take on the vampire hunter. Alright, I want to name them all. Let's speedrun them. David Morono, Rutger Hauer, Keith Ray, Christine Prouty, Jack Gwilym, Peter Fonda, Christopher Plummer, David Carradine, Wallace Shaw, Mark Topping, all played a Van Helsing in the almost 100 years the character has been on the screens, silver and home. And I hadn't even mentioned TV shows, but one is kind of my favorite and is in what I consider a cult classic film from 2004, Hugh Jackman. Finally, I get to talk about Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing, and you have to listen to it. So let's get into it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Markiplier. I'm here, and it's actually night outside now.
Nice try, asshole. So we got a new roommate recently, and I gotta say, and he's dripped out. The Helios Ecto has returned. For the month of October, you can get all the Helios Halloween merch, but act now before it returns to the crypt until next year. Keep up the drip, dog. Don't forget to pay rent. Released in 2004, Van Helsing stars Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing. This was in the time that Hugh Jackman was having his big break, because before this, he was perfectly cast as Wolverine in X-Men and did X2. Hugh Jackman was big, and studios obviously wanted to capitalize on the Hugh hype. The film was written and directed by Stephen Sommers, who also wrote and directed The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Besides Hugh Jackman, it stars Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valeris, probably my first fictional crush, not counting animated characters. She fights vampires and has a sword. And did it all in heels. Claire Daring has a run for her money. It also stars Richard Roxburgh as Count Dracula, who I briefly covered in my video from 2023 Spooktacular about humanized versus animalistic vampire designs. The score is done by Alvin Silvestri, known for doing the scores for the Back to the Future trilogy, Predator, Forrest Gump, the original Lilo and Stitch, and a handful of MCU films. This movie has great talent in it, so why does it seem like it's forgotten and barely talked about? The movie was part of Universal's plan to reinvent the movie monsters. After the success of The Mummy and The Mummy Returns, they got Stephen Sommers and decided to give the film the release date of May 7th, 2004. They gave Van Helsing an action-adventure tone, just like how Sommers gave The Mummy one, and it seemed to help with its success. And just like how The Mummy was inspired by Indiana Jones, they drew heavily from the James Bond films. James Bond? I mean, he does somewhat sneak around like a spy, so I guess that counts. With a budget of about 160 to 170 million, the film would earn a whopping 300 million in the box office, which would classify this as not a flop. So why does the film have such a low score on the critic sites? Rotten Tomatoes has a 24% critic score and a 57% audience score, 2.8 stars on Letterboxd, and a 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb. Reading some of the reviews and from my own experience, I can tell you why. The film really suffers from its time for the CGI aspect. CG was not up to par as it is today, and it's very noticeable that they were very ambitious. You had Dracula's brides flying, Dracula had a massive monster swarm, even werewolves in the movie are giant hulking beasts. You even have Mr. Hyde as a massive human. If they were to make this film today, I think the VFX would be on par with most movies today. Or would it suffer the same fate as the MCU? Who knows? But I think another problem with this film is the amount of characters they got to juggle with. Besides Van Helsing and Anna Flaris, you got Carl, Velkin Valeris, Cardinal Jeanette, and even Victor Frankenstein and Igor. And the classic monsters, you had Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, werewolves, Dracula's brides, hell, the movie opens with Van Helsing hunting Dr. Jekyll, who had become Mr. Hyde a while ago. I mean, we're just missing the Bride, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Phantom of the Opera, and the Invisible Man. At the point of recording, I've yet to watch Van Helsing, The London Assignment, and from my knowledge, it follows Van Helsing going after Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in London. However, that and a self-contained comic that about him in Paris after his fight with Jekyll and Hyde, where he faces Dr. Moreau and his hybrid mutants, the same Dr. Moreau from the story The Island of Dr. Moreau. Not only are each of those stories pulled back, it's also just one main villain. It's Van Helsing versus one person. It's not Van Helsing versus Dracula, but also don't forget about his brides, and there's werewolves there, and we gotta go get the MacGuffin Frankenstein. I think audiences at the time would forgive the film if it was Van Helsing versus Dracula and his brides, with them stopping Dracula and Dracula returning in the sequel with the werewolves. Universal had planned a sequel, but even though the movie was a success, they scrapped the plans. However, for that dark universe with Tom Cruise, they were going to reboot Van Helsing with Tom Cruise as the title character and producer of the film. So did that make Nick Morton a Van Helsing descendant? Tom Cruise actually ended up dropping Van Helsing to do the Mummy movie instead. And obviously, that never made it out of pre-production due to the failure of The Mummy 2017. However, in 2020, the reboot was back in development with Julius Avery hired as director and James Wan attached as a producer. Or at least that's what the last page of the Van Helsing 2004 wiki page said. A Screen Rant article mentions that in April 2023, Julius Avery gave the first update in 3 years that the reboot is still happening, with him currently writing and intended to direct myself. And that it won't be revitalizing that failed dark universe, but instead would be a standalone. However, that was the last news we've heard of it. If this movie ever gets made, I'm going to try and watch it, and... Excuse me. Ooh. I got a murderous man-made monster to kill.